Hello and welcome. My name is Mike Nichols, and I'm the manager of content and social media here at AM. And on behalf of our entire team, I want to thank you for joining us today to learn more about communicating flood risk to the public. And so, with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today, James Logan.
Thank you, Mike. This is a large topic, and we only have 1 hour to cover it. So there's going to be a lot of information that I'm sharing, but also there'll be a lot of things I have to provide high level overviews of. So the first thing I want to start with is just go through the timeline of a flood event, just so that we can build the case for why the warning systems are important. So this is a depiction of a typical flood event that would occur. And when it starts, the water level is low. This is a measurement along the river. And the green now line shows you the current time. Everything to the left is data that's collected through observations. Everything to the right of the green line are predicted values that show you what is expected to happen based on the current prediction window we have, which in this example, we're doing a 2 hour prediction going forward. In the beginning, nothing was happening, but now in our predicted window, we see that there's some rainfall that's expected to happen, but the hydrologic forecast for the river doesn't show any flooding yet. And as we sort of work our way through it, we still see more rainfall in the forecast, and the river's starting to rise, but it's just reached an action level that tells you something's happening. Start being prepared for something that's going to happen. And as we work through this, as it moves forward, in this case, the forecast now is telling us that it's going to go into do major flooding. But the only way we know that is through the forecast information. We don't know it because the river itself hasn't responded at this point to the rainfall that's been falling. So I'll just walk the rest of the way through this. The river floods, or the forecast is showing flooding. It's also showing a peak because the rainfall is starting to drop off. And as time goes by, there's a second rainfall event, not as big as the first rainfall event, that's causing the forecast to show that it's going to go back into major flooding, even though it's expected to drop down to moderate flooding in the meantime. Then as we look at the forecast beyond that next rainfall event, it shows the water level dropping off and continues to drop off until we make it to the event being over. And the reason I was trying to show you this example is that in the case of flash flooding, the more time you have to make decisions, the more time you can get the word to the public, and the more time that you can give them to respond to the warnings, to get out of the way of the flood or to climb to safety, all those things that are important in the notification system. But I think the main point here is that the forecast is really valuable in these situations, and not having a forecast, if you were to use that same example we went through and cut off everything in the forecast and only see what's happening, by the time that the river starts to go into flood, there's not very much time to respond and react to it. And the forecast is giving extra time. And more time you give to people, the better chance that they have of getting out of safety and minimizing the impact of the flooding. So now let's start talking about the concept of how do we want to communicate the right information to the right people related to these events that happen. So first, I just want to remind everybody this is a typical circular loop of how things work when you're trying to deal with flooding. Typically, preparation is the first thing you do. You prepare your systems, your monitoring, all the things you need to know about the flooding. Those systems have to be designed and put in place. Then there's a detection phase where you detect the problem, and then there's a response phase where you respond to the flooding that's happened. And then after the flood is over, you go through recovery and rehabilitation. And then you apply any preventions that you can have for the next time. And then you update all your systems. You go through this sort of cycle of constantly improving your system and learning from each event. And then the next time you do a little bit better job of managing a flood event. And the key things I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the things that you can do in the preparation phase of this, and then where the communication happens, which is once you detect that a flood event is going to happen with a forecast, or that it's happening, then you have to get the notifications out to people, and that communication happens between the detection and the response phase. The response is the result you get from communicating to the public and what they're expected to do, or what the emergency management teams are expected to do. So let's start talking about preparation. So the things that you need to do in advance to prepare a warning system that communicates to the public. So you need to pull together as much information as possible. I'm gonna go through these steps in more detail in some of the later slides, but you need to gather information. You do some analysis so you can identify the areas where you're going to have the most risk, and the places that you want to both monitor, and the places that you want to put in warning systems where there may be people that are at risk. And then you design those systems, and then you design the communications system for the public, and that all happens in the preparation phase. And then you implement those systems in advance of a flood. So let's first start with the information acquisition phase, what that's all about. So the things that you want to pull together information wise are information on vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities cover a lot of different things. This is where's the population, where's infrastructure that can get damaged from the flooding, where are schools and hospitals and all the things that potentially could be impacted. And it's basically like a GIS collection of data that describe all the things that are vulnerable to flooding. Then you collect information on the known hazards. So where are the floodplains currently existing? Where have floods happened in the past that have been impactful to the area? Basically information on where the risk or where the hazards can hit. And another thing that's important in this process of gathering information is to try and gather all the information you can on existing emergency action plans, so that you have what the current plans are out there. Because typically, if you're going to design a flood warning and notification system, that if it's going to be added to what you already have, all these emergency action plans are going to have to be updated with information that's supported by the warning system itself. So it would become part of the process, updating those emergency action plans. So now, looking at the data, when we're trying to identify the potential areas of risk, I really like these diagrams that I'm going to walk you through here, because to me they really express what's going on. But this is gathering the data, but pretty much gathering it in sort of a GIS form. So you're gathering floodplain information, population information, where the population density is at, schools, hospitals, roads, infrastructure, bridges and railroads that could be damaged. All those things are all the sort of the potential vulnerabilities that you have. And then you take that information and you combine it with the hazard information, which is information on where the flooding can be, which, as I said, that could be like the floodplain maps. That it can be information on past floods and where they've done the most damage. It can be a bunch of types of information that describe the potential areas impacted by the hazards. It also can be done through some modeling. A lot of engineering firms will do floodplain modeling just for this purpose. In addition to defining floodplain maps, they'll help identify areas of risk based on maybe applying a 25-year or a 50-year or 100-year design storm across the area that you have, and then figuring out what's the potential inundation of that type of storm coming through the area. But you combine that information, so vulnerabilities to the flood information that you have, and what you end up with is, with that overlay, you can identify areas where you have both vulnerabilities and the hazards exist too. And those are the areas that you want to try and protect with the warning system. These are the places that you want to concentrate your effort on warning people and getting information to emergency managers, because that's the place that would most likely be impacted by flooding in that area. Once you understand the areas that are at risk, then there's a part that involves designing the monitoring system. You may already have a system in place that does monitoring, that you have that information. Many times, and a lot of the clients that we have typically don't have the monitoring system yet either. So the monitoring system design is needed so that you can track what's actually happening out there. And that also, that monitoring system is used as input into the forecasting system, for forecasting to give you more lead time on the potential flooding that's going to happen. So a typical monitoring system, this is just an example of a network. This is actually an area of Denver, Colorado, that has a monitoring network in place. And that's what the monitoring network can look like. This is what some of their typical stations look like. A lot of different places use different designs for the monitoring stations. But the important thing is what they monitor and that they're all placed in locations that support the mission of understanding what potential flooding is either happening or using that data to drive a forecast model. So when it comes to forecast models, hydrology is the professional practice of understanding where water flows when it hits the ground and how it flows. And the forecast models that are typically built, this is an example of a forecast model on the bottom there that has a now line in it, and then it has an observation to the left, all the observations to the left, and all the forecasted information to the right. And that's for a specific point on the river, but this particular model also provides inundation information. So the footprint of the river and how far the inundation goes is actually modeled in this so that you can zoom in and see the areas that are impacted, whether buildings or roads are in that impacted area. And those systems are all tied together with a decision support platform that basically brings all that data and makes it useful in dashboards and methods so that people can understand what's happening. And that's what the decision support platform is all about, is making that data useful so you understand what's actually happening out there on the ground relative to flooding. So then the next step in this process is designing the notification system. And that's what most of the rest of this presentation is about, is the designing the notification system that that helps you provide notifications in those areas that are most at risk, where the intersection of the vulnerabilities and the hazards are on top of each other. When it comes to communicating with the public, there's a lot of things that you need to keep in mind when you're doing it. A lot of these things have come out in projects that we've done in the past. Some of them can be if there's cultural differences that need to be taken into account. We've done warning systems in places in South America where the actual plan in order to get people to safe places is to educate the kids in schools on what to do and how to do things. They bring that information home, and they're the ones who are actually taking their family and their parents to the safe places because they understand what's going on. And some of the older people who it's harder to get that information to them. In particular, in one country, the overall plan was to try to do communication through all the children through the schools on the flood warning system. It was an important consideration in that country because most of the people that are older don't have access to some of the media sources. They don't all have cell phones or YouTube accounts. It's important to take that into account, cultural issues. The communications sometimes have to be done in multiple languages. So a lot of the places we have worked in, they speak at least two major languages that have to be covered. But also we've worked in some places where there are local indigenous languages that are also have to be supported when you're communicating with the public in certain areas. And so another key consideration is what are the language issues. Disabilities, most of these systems, even the siren systems, they're designed not only to have sound, but to have strobes on them that flash that tell you that the sirens are active and information like that to help people. Also, in the design of the emergency response, maybe getting people to evacuate to safe places, all the signage and everything else typically tries to be supported primarily with symbols and things that allow people to understand what they're doing. And there can be words with it, but the symbols are what people tend to learn, and they can follow a route, for example, to safety if there's a sort of standard symbols that are used. And here in the US, there's that type of stuff is used all the time for emergency exits and things like that. There's some standard symbology that's used for those things along with the words. But in other countries, we've had to standardize that and educate the people on the symbology and what they're supposed to do with that. And then another big consideration for the people that you're trying to reach is how do you communicate with those people? In some places, they don't have, a lot of people aren't using broadcast television or cable television, but they use internet or cell phones to get access to information. So that's a channel that becomes really important. Actually, nowadays in almost all cultures, cell phones are a big thing for getting access to, especially the younger people. And there are also methods to contact people through radio, television, mobile apps, send them messages directly in WhatsApp, things like that. So these are all things that need to be taken into account. And unfortunately, this access to mass media technology is changing fast, so all these methods to communicate through that are constantly changing. So that's an area where if you have an early warning system, you might end up having to improve the warning system by using other media mechanisms that come into primary use. WhatsApp is a big example. That's a newer application that now is being used by a lot of people for communication. When you're trying to manage mass communications during an event, there's a lot of things that have to be taken into account. And typically, when we're dealing with large statewide systems or national systems, you end up having to manage the communications and have tiered level control, like regions can have their own system, but then you have a national system that can talk to all the regional systems and work together. If you're just doing a city or a more localized area, then you would really have just one system. You wouldn't have the tiers. But these are things that, depending on the size and the needs you have, that have to be thought about. Some special other considerations, we recommend that the systems that are out there support this CAP protocol, which is it's a common alerting protocol that can communicate, and it has multiple ways of communicating. You can pass messages to it that have, for example, wording in multiple languages. You can have it send text messages. You can have it support the messaging, or even text to voice conversion can be handled by the systems that it talks to, but it's a common protocol. So the reason we like it is because it allows you to build one interface that can talk to lots of other systems and lots of types of systems. So it can interface with mobile, public broadcast systems, Siren. Anybody here who's familiar with the IPOS system that the US uses, the IPOS system is built on top of the CAP protocol. But the CAP protocol is really an international standard, not a US standard. It's just that the US is using it as the primary protocol for the IPOS system. But in other countries, the CAP protocol is used as the main interface. So it's something that's important to consider. It also, by using the CAP protocol, the warning systems that are tied to it can be somewhat standardized because they talk similar. They can draw a geographic boundary like a polygon around the areas you're trying to warn, and then everything in that polygon can get the message either to turn on a siren or automated text messaging to people within that polygon. It gives you a lot of power, and it's really up to the systems that it talks to on how much they can leverage the information that's in that CAP protocol. As far as the devices themselves that are put out there to communicate with the public, the siren systems and everything else, there's just a lot of things you have to take into account, and you want to make sure that these attributes are in the system that you're using. So there's a little bit of analysis goes into identifying how these systems are, what they should be capable of. And on the right is just an example of a siren and example of a control box that would control a siren. But as you can see, there's a lot of equipment in that control box because this particular siren has a lot of sophistication on what it can do. And that control box allows it to do text to voice and to send different type of pre-made messages and do a lot of other things. Plus it handles the communications. Usually these types of systems, you want redundant communications to all the devices so that if one communication method breaks down, there's another way to talk to it. And so those are all things to take into account. But this is just a list of things to think about when you're choosing the devices for communicating out there. For example, when you're doing siren network work, you have to do a design. You have to basically place the sirens in places that allow the information to get to the most people you're trying to reach. And this is an optimization problem. You're trying to locate all the sirens in a way that hits the most people in the most densely populated areas. And that's how to make the best, most cost-effective use of the siren networks that you put out, is making sure that they can reach people. They also have to be designed so that the output levels that the sirens can produce can overcome background noise. If, for example, if you have a house right next to a highway, the background noise on the highway is so high, it's hard to hear a siren unless the siren is much louder than if you had a siren that was in a quiet neighborhood, for example. So those are all the kinds of things that need to be taken into account, and you actually have to do a design of the siren network itself. Now let's talk about how you put all this together for a system. So we've explained all the things you need to think about and the main parts of this type of a warning system, but how do they go together? So you need to have some type of a monitoring and forecasting system so you can know what's going on and understand what's happening out there with rainfall and flooding and forecasted information on forecasted rainfall and forecasted flooding. You need decision support software that allows you to understand that information and make good decisions about what's really happening out there and what it means and what you think the risks are. And then you want to have a system where you can initiate all the notifications and talk and get the message out to the public with whatever actions you're asking them to do, whether you're asking them to evacuate areas and go to higher ground or don't drive in the roads. There's lots of types of messaging that goes out that are all related to this type of risk, and that has to be handled by that system. So this presentation, like I said, it's very high level. I want to leave you with some final thoughts. There's a lot more detail in all the areas that we can go into. And as I said, some of your questions we can hopefully answer. And if there's something that's a deeper question you have, we can talk with you about it and at least give you more information based on our experience with implementing these types of systems. So some final thoughts here. Communicating flood risk is a complicated process, and the ever-changing part about it really is how to communicate it, and also as we get better and better at forecasting and understanding what's going to happen, that gives more and more time so that there's more time to do things like evacuations or prepare for the flooding or put out sandbags or whatever. How to communicate is different depending on where you're trying to do this. I'll just say if you're doing something in South America, you'd have a different design of a system and how it works than if you're doing it in Kansas City, Missouri. The systems need to match the culture, the people, the ways they communicate. It needs to do that. The concepts are all the same, but the specific way you do things is a little bit different depending on where you're trying to do this. The emergency action plans are really important and they need to support their own process. Usually, when you put these systems together, there are a lot of stakeholders that are involved, and the stakeholders need to be involved in the process of understanding the system, how it applies to whatever their particular area of responsibility is, whether they're a government official or an emergency manager or whatever their roles are. All those stakeholders need to have some say and definitely knowledge about how the system works and how it's best going to support whatever areas that they have responsibilities for. And then one important thing, and that's more about that circular diagram that I showed you earlier, is that the system should not just be built and then you walk away and say, okay, we're done, we have a warning system. Every time there's an event, you need to examine the event and figure out what worked and what didn't work, and adjust the system to try to address any weaknesses that happened in that event so that the next time those weaknesses don't happen and the system performs better. A continuous improvement process for these types of systems, and they should be considered a live system in that way. It needs to be constantly improved. As, for example, as social media methods change, you want the system to be able to keep up with that, because we've had a lot of events that I've been involved in where whatever the key social media aspect was at the time the system was designed, things shifted and people started using a different method of communication, and so those social media type things broke down. Text messaging at one point was really a common method for communicating, but it's turning that a lot of people are doing things other ways and that they actually use other methods of communicating. So the question that we're trying to talk about here, and as I said, there's a lot more detail behind all this than what we've talked about, but the key thing we're trying to do is how do you reach the right people, and the right people are the people that are most at risk and most vulnerable to whatever hazard that's hitting them. You want to get the messages to them at the right time, which is with enough time so that they can do something about it. So if they have to go to higher ground or do whatever, they need the information early enough so that they can do something about it. And you want to get the information to them in the right way. That's by getting the messages so that it actually reaches as many people as possible and reaches them in a way they understand it. And then you want them to have the right action. So the messaging has to be clear. And if there's actions required, the messaging has to include those actions that you're asking people to do, whether you're telling them to prepare to evacuate, or you're telling them to evacuate, or you're telling them to stay off the roads and not drive. That's the safest places to be home. There's lots of things. So all these things work together to save people's lives. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Mike.
Hey, James, thank you. Those were some really important insights, and it looks like they sparked some really great questions from the audience. So, how do you balance the risk of when you're looking ahead and deciding how far out you want to forecast and warn people? How do you balance the risk of giving false alarms versus the risk of not giving people enough time?
That is a really good question. And the reason it's a good question is that if you send out false alarms, then the public will not trust the system that is warning them. They'll lose trust in it. They won't believe it. Then when there's a real alarm, then they won't react to it the way they should. So false alarms are an important thing. Almost all the systems that I've talked about here do not automatically measure something and start sending out messages to the public. They actually have a human who is, it's their job to say, yes, this is real, and they turn the switch on to send all the messaging out. And so that human in the loop is pretty important to try and mitigate from false alarms and things that shouldn't happen. Because I've also been around automated systems where they have a bad sensor and the siren goes off or something like that. And if that happens, people will lose trust in the system and not believe it, and they won't react properly to the event like they should. So human in the loop is pretty important, though there are places that automation is important. And we've put in systems like low water crossings for deep water, where if the water's in the road and the water's deep enough to wash the car down the road, we block people from going into those roads. And that's a system where if the water level, it should be on, because it could happen in the middle of the night at a specific location because of a local, very localized event. And there is a need for automation in some cases, but that's not the same kind of automation as sending a text message to a whole city saying it's flooding, everybody should run to higher ground, and it not raining outside. That's a different kind of problem. But blocking a road that's flooded is an example of automation. There's also some more localized siren systems that are being developed that have local automation. So they might be something that could be used in a situation where people are sleeping. I actually had this project come up last year in Africa. There's a game reserve where a flash flood came down the river and it killed a bunch of people that were on this game reserve in these campsites. They want a warning system that lets them know when the flooding is going to come, and they want to be able to get the people out of their awake in the middle of the night that ended up getting washed away in the flooding in that particular example.
Here's an interesting question. So, during a big enough event that can trigger mass internet outages, what do you recommend for backup communications in a scenario like that?
So it depends. Let's just talk about like controlling a siren network. So I mentioned there needs to be redundant communications. Typically, the siren networks that we have been involved in putting out, they can be activated by line of sight radio, which is a controlled system that owned by the agency that manages the sirens. So it's a very controlled system, but they also have cell phone interfaces on them so that when the cell phone network is up and running, the programs can be updated on the siren, or maintenance activities can be done, other things can be done. Plus, it's a separate extra channel. But as we saw in the flooding that happened in North Carolina, there was flooding that just wiped out the cell networks through the mountains there, and they didn't have access to cell coverage for a long time. But those line of sight radio systems that are built, they're designed to operate, they run off of batteries, and they don't depend on local infrastructure like cell towers. And so it gives you like an alternative. So whenever you do have redundant communications, those redundant communications have to be dependent on completely different infrastructure so that any of the infrastructure that they use, that doesn't bring down both methods of communication.
That makes sense. Thank you, James. Here's a related question to that. How important is the data collection method to obtain good data during an event to alarm on? Now, let me give you what they mean by that. They said the example is sending over cell versus satellite versus IoT versus radio, etc. So I think they're talking about different types of communication channels.
Yeah. So the communication channels are important. As we mentioned in the case of North Carolina, everything that was based off of cell network transmissions, that stuff stopped communicating. So they lost all the data from those type of stations. The line of sight radio system continued to work because they were running off of batteries that are designed to basically keep it running for like more than a month, even without sunshine charging the battery, the solar panels charging the battery. So those types of systems work better. Satellite is valuable because the satellite infrastructure is completely in a different place than the local infrastructure is. So it's one separate kind of redundancy. If you send messaging out via satellite, then it's unlikely that you're having a disaster in one place at the same time you're having a similar disaster at the satellite downlink facility and everything else. So satellite is a good technology because it doesn't depend on local infrastructure. IoT, most IoT is dependent on local infrastructure. So it uses somewhere it has a gateway that puts it onto the cell network or does something like that. So IoT by itself, the majority of it is not good. But if IoT is using satellite where the local infrastructure isn't impacted, and as long as the stations that are doing the measurement have the ability to run for a long time without any local power or anything else for a long period of time, like 30 days or 40 days, that type of technology is viable for the monitoring. But I've always not believed in cell as a critical communications technology, but line of sight radio that's controlled by the local agency or satellite, I think, are both viable technologies for running when things are locally are really bad because of a disaster happening.
Again, James, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to share all this fantastic information with us. And thanks to all of you for attending today. Thanks again, and have a great day.